What if I told you that a man who died in 1945 predicted exactly what would happen to Donald Trump in 2026? And what if I told you that this prediction is so shocking, so specific, that it will change the way you see everything that's happening in America right now? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will shake you to your core. Edgar Cayce. The name alone sends shivers down the spine of anyone who has studied prophecy. Known as the Sleeping Prophet, this unassuming man from Kentucky became one of the most documented psychics in history. But Cayce wasn't some carnival fortune teller. He was a devout Christian, a photographer, a Sunday school teacher. Yet when he entered his trance state, he accessed information that defied explanation. He predicted world wars, economic crashes, technological advances, and earth changes with an accuracy that still baffles researchers today. Between 1901 and 1944, Edgar Cayce gave over 14,000 readings while in a self-induced sleep state. These weren't vague predictions. They were detailed, specific, often medical in nature, and they were recorded by stenographers. The Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach still houses these records. Scientists, doctors, and researchers have studied them for decades. And buried within these thousands of readings are prophecies about America's future that point directly to events happening right now. Now here's where it gets interesting. Cayce made specific predictions about a time he called the Great Change, a period when America would face its greatest test. He spoke of a leader who would emerge during a time of tremendous division, a figure who would polarize the nation like never before. He described economic upheaval, natural disasters, and a moment when the very soul of America would hang in the balance. Sound familiar? But Cayce went further. He didn't just predict general chaos. He outlined a specific sequence of events that would unfold in the mid-2020s. And when you line up his readings with current events, the parallels are absolutely chilling. He spoke of a return, a second coming of a controversial figure. He mentioned the year 2026, specifically in connection with what he called a great reckoning for America. And he described a scenario that matches, almost point by point, what many analysts are now predicting for Donald Trump's second term. Let's be clear about something. Edgar Cayce never mentioned Donald Trump by name. How could he? Trump wasn't born until 1946, a year after Cayce died. But Cayce described archetypes, patterns, and cycles. He spoke about America's karma, about lessons the nation would need to learn. And he detailed a specific type of leader who would emerge during America's darkest hour. A builder, he called him. Someone connected to towers and gold. Someone who would promise to restore greatness, but who would face an unprecedented challenge in the process. The reading that catches everyone's attention is number 3976-26. In this reading from 1944, Cayce was asked about America's future. He spoke about upheavals that would come, about changes in the political system, about a time when Americans would question everything they once believed. He said that in the 2020s, there would be a shifting of the poles, and while many interpret this literally as geological pole shifts, Cayce researchers now believe he was also speaking metaphorically about political poles, about the extreme polarization that would tear at the fabric of American society. But here's the specific part that makes people's jaws drop. In this same reading, Cayce described a period around 2026 when a leader who had been celebrated and then rejected would face his ultimate test. He spoke of towers falling, not just physical towers, but towers of power, towers of influence. He described a scenario where this leader would be given a second chance, a return to position, but that this return would not bring the peace and prosperity the leader promised. Instead, it would trigger the very crisis it was meant to prevent. Think about Trump's history with towers. Trump Tower in New York. His entire brand built on the symbolism of reaching toward the sky, of gold-plated excess, of building monuments to success. Cayce's symbolism of towers and gold appearing in readings about America's future leader is impossible to ignore. But it goes deeper than symbolism. Cayce spoke about timing. He used astrological cycles in his readings, and he noted that certain planetary alignments would mark turning points for nations and leaders. Researchers have analyzed these cycles, and several major astrological events converge in 2026. Specifically, a rare alignment that Cayce associated with the fall of leaders who overreach. This alignment happens in late 2026, and according to Cayce's framework, it marks a point of no return. Now let's talk about what Cayce actually predicted would happen. According to his readings, this controversial leader would return to power, but his second period in office would be marked by three major crises that happen in rapid succession. First, an economic event that shakes global markets. Cayce described it as a crumbling of false foundations, a moment when systems built on debt and speculation would collapse. He said this would happen suddenly, catching everyone off guard, and that it would be triggered by something connected to international trade and alliances breaking down. Does this sound relevant right now? With Trump's promises to implement massive tariffs, to renegotiate international agreements, to shake up the global economic order? Cayce said the leader's own policies would inadvertently trigger the crisis he claimed he would prevent. And in 2026, according to the reading, this economic shockwave would hit with full force. The second crisis Cayce described was environmental. He spoke of natural disasters increasing in frequency and intensity during this period. Specifically, he mentioned the East Coast of America facing water-related catastrophes. Now, Cayce was famous for his predictions about Earth changes, and while some of his timelines have been debated, the pattern is undeniable. He said that human actions, particularly actions by leaders who ignore environmental warnings, would accelerate these natural responses. In 2026, he saw flooding, extreme weather, and what he called the sea, claiming what man had built. Think about Trump's environmental policies, his position on climate change, his focus on deregulation. Whether you agree with these policies or not, Cayce's reading suggests that in 2026, the consequences of ignoring environmental warnings would manifest in dramatic and undeniable ways, and he specifically connected this to the leadership in place at that time. But the third crisis is the most shocking. Cayce spoke of a constitutional crisis, a moment when the very foundations of American democracy would be questioned. He described a scenario where the leader would refuse to accept limitations on his power, where institutions would clash, and where the American people would be forced to choose between security and freedom. He used the phrase civil strife repeatedly in his readings about this period. Here's where it gets really unsettling. Cayce described a specific event that would serve as a trigger point. He called it the judgment of the builders, a moment when those who had built their fortunes and power on questionable foundations would face legal and public reckoning. Now, Trump has been facing legal challenges unlike any former president in history. Multiple indictments, civil cases, accusations that have divided the nation. Cayce's reading suggests that in 2026, these legal issues would reach a crescendo, a point where they could no longer be ignored or dismissed. According to the reading, this legal crisis would happen while the leader is in office, creating a situation never before seen in American history. Cayce described it as a test of the Republic, a moment when Americans would have to decide which principles they truly valued. He said the outcome would not be what anyone expected, that both sides would find themselves shocked by what unfolds. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This sounds too specific. How could Cayce have known all this? And that's exactly the right question to ask. Skeptics have always questioned Cayce's methods and accuracy. But here's what makes Cayce different from other prophets and psychics. His track record is documented. His hits are undeniable. He predicted both world wars before they happened. He described the stock market crash of 1929 with eerie precision. He predicted the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls decades before they were found. He described medical treatments that didn't exist in his time, but have since been proven effective. The man had an accuracy rate that statistical analysis shows could not have been random chance. So when Cayce made specific predictions about America in the 2020s, researchers pay attention. But let's go deeper into what makes the 2026 prediction so specific. In reading 1602-3, given in 1938, Cayce was asked about the future of democracy. He said that America would face a choice in the middle of the 2020s decade, a choice between moving forward with evolved consciousness or falling backward into authoritarian patterns. He specifically mentioned the number 26 in connection with this choice point. Now, Cayce often spoke in symbolic language, but his stenographers recorded exactly what he said, and the number 26 appears multiple times in readings about America's political future. What exactly did he see happening? According to the synthesis of multiple readings, Cayce described a scenario where the controversial leader would implement policies that initially appeared successful. There would be a brief period, perhaps the first year of the return, where supporters would feel vindicated. Economic numbers might look good. Certain promises might appear to be kept. But Cayce warned this was a false dawn, what he called the calm before the great storm. In 2026, according to these readings, three things would converge. The economic policies would begin to show their true cost. The international relationships that had been damaged would collapse entirely, leaving America isolated at a crucial moment, and the internal divisions would reach a breaking point, manifested in what Cayce described as unprecedented civil unrest. But here's what makes this prophecy truly shocking. Cayce didn't predict failure or success in the traditional sense. He predicted transformation through crisis. He said that what would appear to be disaster would actually be the necessary catalyst for America's evolution. He spoke of the old systems needing to die so that new ones could emerge. And he specifically said that the leader at the center of this storm was playing a role in a much larger cosmic drama, whether he knew it or not. Cayce described Trump, though not by name, as a disruptor whose purpose was to expose the cracks in the foundation. In this view, everything that happens in 2026, all the chaos and crisis, serves a higher purpose. It forces Americans to examine their values, to question their systems, to decide who they really want to be as a nation. Cayce said that by the end of 2026, America would not be the same country it was at the beginning of the year. The change would be that profound. Now let's talk about something that makes many people uncomfortable. Cayce also spoke about violence. In reading 3976-18, he described a period when the nation would come close to internal conflict, when armed factions would face each other, and when the military would be forced to make a choice about which side to support. He didn't describe this as inevitable, but as a very real possibility, depending on the choices leaders made. The trigger point, according to Cayce, would be a contested action by the leader, something seen by half the country as necessary, and by the other half as tyrannical. This action would happen in 2026, and it would push the nation to the brink. Cayce described troops in the streets of major cities, not due to foreign invasion, but due to internal breakdown. He saw this as a fork in the road moment, where America would either pull back from the edge or plunge into chaos. But here's what gives many Cayce researchers hope. In the same readings, where he describes these dark possibilities, Cayce also describes a path through. He speaks of a spiritual awakening that would emerge from the crisis, of people remembering what truly matters, of communities coming together across political divides. He says that the crisis of 2026 would ultimately serve to unite rather than divide, but only after things got much worse, before they got better. Cayce was specific about timing, within 2026. He mentioned the period between August and November as particularly critical. Now think about what happens in November of 2026. Midterm elections. According to Cayce's vision, these elections would be unlike any in American history. He described them as a referendum, not just on policies, but on the very nature of American governance. And he suggested that the results would shock everyone, that neither party would get what they expected. One of the most intriguing aspects of Cayce's predictions involves what he called the unexpected ally. He described a figure who would emerge during the crisis of 2026, someone from an unexpected place, who would offer a third path forward. This person wouldn't be a traditional politician. They would come from outside the system entirely. And according to Cayce, this figure would begin to unite people across the political spectrum by focusing on practical solutions rather than ideological battles. Could this be someone we already know? Could it be someone who hasn't emerged yet? Cayce didn't give a name, but he gave characteristics. A healer, he called them. Someone with a background in bringing people together. Someone who had stayed out of politics until the crisis forced them to step in. Researchers are watching to see who might fit this description as 2026 approaches. Let's address the elephant in the room. Can prophecy be changed? Cayce believed that the future wasn't fixed. He said repeatedly that predictions showed probable outcomes based on current trajectories, but that human free will could alter the course. He emphasized that the purpose of prophecy wasn't to predict inevitable doom, but to warn people so they could make different choices. So, if Cayce's 2026 predictions are accurate based on current trends, does that mean they must happen? According to Cayce's own philosophy, no. If enough people become aware, if enough leaders make different choices, if enough consciousness shifts, the timeline can change. But he also warned that the closer we get to a predicted event without changing course, the more difficult it becomes to alter the outcome. We're now in 2025, heading rapidly towards that crucial year. The pieces Cayce described are falling into place. The controversial leader has returned. The divisions are deeper than ever. The international order is fracturing. The economic warning signs are flashing. All the ingredients for Cayce's predicted crisis are present. The question is whether we're locked into this timeline, or whether awareness itself can shift what comes next. Some researchers believe Cayce's prophecies are designed to be self-preventing. By revealing what could happen, they inspire people to act differently. In this view, the very fact that we're talking about the 2026 predictions might be what's needed to avoid the worst outcomes. Others believe that certain events are fixed points, that the crisis must happen because the lessons must be learned. Here's something most people don't know. Cayce gave additional readings specifically about prayers, and group consciousness affecting outcomes. He said that focused intention by groups of people could literally shift timelines. He described it as quantum in nature, though he didn't use that term. The more people hold a vision of a different outcome, the more that outcome becomes probable rather than just possible. This brings us to another shocking element of Cayce's prediction. He spoke about a moment in 2026 when time itself would seem to accelerate, when events that would normally take years would unfold in weeks or days. He described it as a compression point, a moment when history speeds up. Those who have studied Cayce's more esoteric readings connect this to consciousness shifts, to moments when humanity makes quantum leaps in awareness. What would this look like practically? Imagine a scenario where multiple crises hit simultaneously in 2026. Economic collapse, natural disaster, political crisis, all happening within a short window. In the chaos and shock, people would be forced to drop their old patterns and preconceptions. In that space, according to Cayce, something new could emerge. A new way of organizing society, new leadership structures, new economic models. He described it as birth pains, the necessary discomfort that comes before new life emerges. But Cayce was also clear about the danger. He said that in moments of crisis, people become vulnerable to authoritarian solutions. They trade freedom for the promise of security. They accept limitations on liberty because they're afraid. He warned that in 2026, this temptation would be stronger than ever, and that resisting it would require tremendous courage from ordinary citizens. The role of Donald Trump in all this, according to Cayce's framework, is almost Shakespearean in its tragedy and complexity. He's not the villain or the hero in this story. He's the catalyst, the force that brings everything to a head. Cayce might say that Trump's soul agreed to play this role before incarnating, that he's fulfilling a karmic purpose for the nation. In this view, everything that happens, even the painful parts, serves the evolution of American consciousness. What happens to Trump personally in 2026, according to these readings? Cayce described the leader facing his own moment of truth, a point where he must choose between ego and service. He saw this leader being offered a choice, to step back and allow transformation, or to dig in and resist. The choice this leader makes, according to Cayce, determines whether the transition is relatively smooth or catastrophically chaotic. Now here's the part that might be hardest to accept. Cayce suggested that regardless of what we think about this leader, regardless of whether we support or oppose him, he's playing exactly the role he needs to play in the cosmic script. Our job isn't to judge him, but to learn the lessons his presidency brings up for us. What are our own shadows around power, authority, truth, and justice? How do we respond when our values are challenged? These are the questions Cayce says we must ask ourselves. As we move through 2025 toward that crucial year, the signs will become clearer. Cayce gave specific markers to watch for. He mentioned trouble with China reaching a critical point. He spoke of the dollar facing a serious challenge to its supremacy. He described natural disasters on the West Coast and flooding on the East Coast happening in the same season. He talked about a major technology disruption that would affect communications globally. These would be the signals that the timeline is unfolding as he foresaw. But remember, Cayce also spoke about hope. He said that after the crisis of 2026, America would emerge renewed, not destroyed, but transformed. He saw a period beginning around 2027 or 2028, where new systems would take root, where a different kind of leadership would emerge, and where Americans would rediscover their common humanity. The crisis wasn't the end of the story. It was the turning point. What can you do with this information? That's the real question. Cayce would say first, don't panic. Fear creates the very outcomes we're trying to avoid. Second, prepare practically. Have resources available to help yourself and others during potential disruptions. Third, and most importantly, work on your own consciousness. The external world reflects the internal state of humanity. As individuals heal their own divisions, the collective divisions heal. Cayce believed that ordinary people hold extraordinary power. He said that the future isn't written by leaders and governments. It's written by the daily choices of millions of individuals. Every act of kindness, every bridge built across divides, every moment of clarity and compassion shifts the collective field. In this view, you're not a powerless observer of prophecy unfolding. You're an active participant in creating what comes next. The prophecy of Edgar Cayce for Donald Trump in 2026 is ultimately a prophecy for all of us. It's about America's destiny, about humanity's evolution, about the birth pains of a new era. Whether Trump is the figure Cayce saw, whether the events unfold exactly as predicted, whether we change the timeline through our choices, we're living through a pivotal moment in history, and we each have a role to play. If this information resonated with you, if it made you think differently about what's coming, then share this video. Talk about it with friends and family, not to spread fear, but to spread awareness. Subscribe to this channel for more prophecies and predictions about our collective future. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss updates as we track how these prophecies unfold in real time. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Do you think Cayce was right? Are we headed for the crisis he predicted? Or can we change the timeline? Let's discuss this together. The future isn't something that happens to us. It's something we create together. And the time to start creating consciously is right now.